This is Delhi. Please stand by for our next program. This is All India Radio. In our national program of talks tonight, we bring you a panel discussion entitled Women-Led Development and G-20. The panelists are Ms. Meenakshi Datta Ghosh, former Special Secretary, Ministry of Health and Secretary, Ministry of Panchayati Raj, Dr. Suneeta Mukherjee, former bureaucrat and UNFPA or the United Nations Population Fund official, and Deepak Gupta, media personality who initiates and moderates the discussion.
The Prime Minister stated, quote, "During our G20 presidency, we shall present India's experiences, learnings and models as possible templates for others, particularly the developing world," unquote. In this context, women-led development and the sustained work by the government in bringing gender parity are the cornerstones of India's success story. Needless to mention, some chapters of this story still remain as work in progress. Yet the country has ample of learnings and best practices to be shared with the world, especially within the global south. We have with us Dr. Meenakshi Datta Ghosh and Dr. Suneeta Mukherjee. Warm welcome to the esteemed panel. And at the very onset, let me come to you, Dr. Mukherjee. It will be incorrect to believe that India is delivering very well in the gender equity and equality sectors. Yet we have certainly come a long way and have multiple islands of success which India would like to share with the G20 member countries. Now, how do you reflect on that?
Deepak, you're absolutely right. In the gender gap index, we have not performed well. So it seems, has any work been done? But we have major islands of success. I believe that reduction in maternal mortality ratio is our biggest success. When the MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, began, we were at 560. And at that time, the MDG seemed a distant goal. Now with SDGs on, we are on track. I'm very happy to share with my listeners that we have reached below 100 now. This has been possible by a large number of institutional deliveries. The institutional deliveries are now almost 90%. So this is our major success for women, because once a woman can control her fertility, she can control her life. Another very important success is women, more and more girls are doing higher secondary. So I'm very happy to see girls getting educated. And once they get educated, the age of marriage gets postponed. They start looking for a job and looking for avenues of employment, which would add to the GDP of the country.
Right. And this is, I think, more or less in last 1 decade or maybe a little more than that.
Yes,
no?
yes.
Yeah.
Great progress has been made. You know, if one indicator is how much do women contribute in decision making in the family. There was a time that the rural women had very little influence in decision making. I'm happy to tell you recent data shows that 88% women are now participating in decision making in the family.
Right. Mrs. Ghosh, now what's your take on this?
One very key indicator is what is happening to these women after the reduction in MMR and after they are getting greater control over their lives. And we find that this government has instituted a periodic labour force survey which very accurately records the female worker population ratio, the female labour force participation rate, the female unemployment rate, and all these things are being tracked and addressed. And we find that, for example, in April 2021, just over 20% of female children between the ages of 15 to 19 have actually completed at least 12 years of school. Now, this is a huge improvement on what was. Fortunately for us, the National Education Policy 2020 has also been fairly visionary. It even has a gender inclusion fund, which is not there before, which is the All India Survey on Higher Education 2020 shows the gross enrollment rate of females standing at 27.3, exceeding that of men. The boys are at 26.9. So this itself shows how much control women have got over their lives. The mothers have got control over the household, taking decisions, etc. Their children are able to go out and complete bare minimum schooling.
Exactly. Now, somewhere we do see that I think PRIs, which is Panchayati Raj institutions, surely have a role to play there. And I think almost 33% women as the members of the PRI, Gram Panchayat, Zilla Panchayat and municipal corporations. How successful I think this whole experiment with PRIs have been, especially when we talk about bringing about gender parity and decision making and the empowerment, the process of empowerment.
When the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Acts came into being and began to get enforced, at that time, believe you me, we had a population of 800 million in the 1990s. These constitutional amendments are a huge island of success. Now, it so happens that the World Economic Forum brings out a global gender gap index. And the gender gap index for 2022, as usual, India was ranked at 135 out of 146 countries.
Right.
India has consistently rejected this index and said this is wrong. Now, in January 2023, the World Economic Forum has agreed that they will finally now recognize the need to enumerate women's participation in local government, Panchayati Raj institutions, and urban municipalities, because that constitutional amendment of 1992-93 actually created space for 3.2 million women.
Right.
1.4 in panchayats and the other in urban municipalities.
Right.
Now that was never recognized, and now it's going to be recognized. The second thing is that because of the Panchayati Raj Acts, legislation, women gained political empowerment, economic empowerment, decision making has already been referred to by Suneeta.
Right.
Their voices were heard. Because there were women elected to the panchayats, the participation of women at all levels of political activity increased by 28 to 30%.
Right.
But the attendance of women in Gram Sabha meetings increased by 68 to 70%.
Manifold.
So that, really brought about a huge thing. The other thing, of course, is that when you have women over there, there's much more talk of primary health, primary education, nutrition. Domestic violence gets a huge look over.
Yeah.
And in the areas where women are predominating in elected positions, domestic violence completely comes down because they have nowhere to show their face. So this has been a huge plus for women and given them a chance to transform themselves. They have changed.
Right.
They have begun, they realize they are now more visible. They realize that by getting control over assets, over resources, and even challenging men or talking to men face to face, they feel a sense of empowerment.
Agency.
Agency comes into it, which they never had before.
Exactly.
So that is something which I think India should be hugely proud of. And this latest announcement in January 2023
at Davos.
will change the world perception,
Right.
and of course will change our ranking in the global gender index.
Yeah.
That's a huge thing.
Absolutely. Dr. Mukherjee, let me come to you. There are still a large number of women losing their lives while giving birth, which is such a sad state of affairs, I must say. And they are unable to make informed choices about whether or not to marry, with whom to marry, when to bear a child, and even in making decisions about contraception. And still worse, many girls and women face physical and emotional abuse and within the domestic confines. Aren't so many countries doing better than India when we talk about sexual and reproductive health and rights? This whole parabola of SRHR, as we say. And do we have any lessons to gather from here? Or perhaps even best practices, which I think India can share with the other G20 member nations.
Yes, Deepak, absolutely right. Though we were the first country to introduce the family program in the world, our contraceptive prevalence rate remained low. Choices available to women remained on paper. And contraceptives were neither available, or even if available, women did not have the right to ask for it. I would think this is primarily because the patriarchal kind of society that we follow,
Right.
where men took all the decisions and women were not empowered. This is fast changing with the changing world.
Right.
The globalization, digital world, everything has brought about a change. These self-help groups which have been set up, and there are a very large number of them, 80 million is what I heard. About 80 million. The self-help groups also, where women get together, they are led by women, they have bank accounts, they discuss the violence, the other issues. The whole basket of choices is now available to women. It hadn't been for a long time because objections of the women themselves, led by perhaps men or advised perhaps by men. But now all that is changing, and with the women looking up to the sky, they are taking decisions. About 70% of the women in rural and urban areas combined have mobile phones. They're able to communicate with each other, talk to each other, seek help when needed. So things are fast changing. I mentioned earlier reduction in maternal mortality ratio, where I must say at the outset that no woman should die giving birth. And yet we face so many maternal deaths. Perhaps a small, minuscule will not be prevented if you have some other complications like heart problem or diabetes or acute diabetes or kidney problem or others. But in most cases, these are preventable deaths and can be prevented. So the country is working hard at it. The governments are working hard at it. And we have achieved success, as I have talked earlier. Contraceptive choices have also increased. The unmet need has decreased. Women and even unmarried boys and girls are able to access contraceptives if necessary.
Right.
Prevention of HIV/AIDS, other diseases also requires use of contraceptives.
Right.
So all that is happening and change is occurring. One of the major issues for women is also unpaid work. Because when they are not paid, when they don't have an income in hand, they cannot exercise the choice of buying contraceptives or accessing even sanitary napkins or taking decisions on their own. But all that is changing, and I'm sure you will see women moving ahead in this century itself.
Absolutely. Mrs. Ghosh, I recall very well, I think you were also heading the National Rural Health Mission at one point in time. And there was a lot of talk about engendering the whole sexual reproductive health approach, especially engendering the family planning program. Yeah, so from the gender perspective, do you really think that if we see it today, as we stand in 2023, we managed to bring about some bit of gender parity in our delivery of health services, particularly from the perspective of SR, HR, and that is sexual reproductive health and family planning?
I'd like to say up front that I think there we abysmally failed because on one parameter, because of the patriarchal mindset. Most unfortunately, surgical interventions for family planning remained confined to women. And in state after state, we went through this data with a very fine comb. Even though vasectomies were popularized in Andhra Pradesh, and vasectomies got a huge fillip in Andhra Pradesh, but even across South India, certainly across North India, East and West India, it was tubectomies which led the way. And in family planning, as we are all aware, tubectomies have their own complications. And to begin with, a lot more fatal consequences of those tubectomies. And the men would just simply not come forward, despite the fact they ran so many campaigns, state-wise campaigns, along with the state family planning directorates, advised and encouraged and promoted and hailed by the central government, but it didn't cut much
NSV,
ice.
I remember, no scalpel vasectomy.
Yes, NSV, that
No scalpel
vasectomy. But whatever it was, it didn't cut much ice, and the women continue. So there was no engendering in the family planning as such. But yes, I will say one thing, that I think things have changed now, and there is a lot more exposure. And I think more than the patriarchal mindsets which we may find even inside our homes to some extent on one or the other count, we may not, more or less in different degrees. However, exposure to social media and has taken over. And so mindsets are, even if it is only the mindset of a 14-year-old child, even that is affecting the dynamics in the household. And that is something which we have become mindful of, and it's definitely showing up in our family planning and our sexual and reproductive health outcomes.
Mrs. Mukherjee, if I may ask you, would there be then, in this case, after this discussion on the sexual reproductive health, any kind of best practices that India could possibly offer to the other member nations in G20?
See, one of the best practices is, from the negative point of view, is that we did not accept injectables and implants for a very long time, or vasectomy, no scalpel vasectomy, for a very long time. At what impact it had and what impact it is having now. I am very proud to say that my husband undertook no scalpel vasectomy, and it was so simple, a matter of 5-10 minutes, and he went back to work. I mean, it is so simple, yet the fear of men that what will it do to my sexual organs just haunts, and we are not able to break that mindset.
Right.
So no scalpel vasectomy, as Meenakshi pointed out, is something that should be popularized, and male participation should be encouraged in the whole program, because without male participation, without male partnership, women cannot move ahead.
We'll come to that point also, I think. And now I think, let me come to you, Dr. Ghosh. From fodder to food to forestry. Yeah, women have played a significant role, as we all know, and in many cases led the process of change. Yet, the recognition given to the women force, including equal opportunity and wages, remain a distant reality, at least in the unorganized and private sector. So, how do you see the conditions changing in the coming years?
Let me first cover the unorganized and organized sectors which you just mentioned. Now, taking the case of India, there are over 500 million workers across India's organized and unorganized sectors, of whom 90% are in the unorganized sector. Now, in August 2019 and September 2020, the Government of India codified 29 existing labor laws into 4 modern labor codes.
Right.
Why I'm mentioning this? Because this has a direct bearing on women. It has a bearing on women entering the labor force, which I had referred to earlier, and on women remaining in the labor force.
Sustaining them.
Because with these 4 modern labor codes, minimum wage has been universalized. That was not the case till now. So that's one thing. Second, for women workers, maternity leave has been increased from 12 weeks to 26 weeks, which is really, a fairly handsome incentive.
Rise,
Incentive,
absolutely.
yeah. So that's what I wanted to mention over there straight away, that we typically look upon the unorganized sector as, God knows whether the workers are even being paid or whether their salaries are being given at the end of 6 months, and that too with a cut and this and that. So all that, at least a beginning has been made in that direction. The second thing I'd like to say about it, you've asked about whether conditions moving ahead will change. Let me say up front, I'm optimistic and I'm confident that they will. And there are reasons for this. The first is that India is continuing to invest in human capital, in infrastructure, and in governance. Budget 2023 would indicate that this trend is continuing. And not only that, we are on the verge of actually very neatly putting together the 4th pillar, and that is education.
Right.
Now, the thing I already mentioned, the new education policy and the gender inclusion fund, which is a great step forward. That also is 2020, so it's quite recent. But more than that, I think our future, the future of our women, lies in India's very, very rapidly expanding digital economy, the digital sector.
Right.
We already have over 600 million internet users.
Yeah.
By 2025, we are claiming, or rather industry is claiming, that we will have 900 million internet users. Now, this digital economy is doing nothing but pushing and pushing for productivity and pushing for innovation. This is what the digital economy is doing. The story only begins there.
Right.
And in the meanwhile, in the field of education, we have these ed-tech startups.
Right.
They have come up and they are now just taking over. And these ed-tech startups, just to talk of the past 2 years, they have doubled in the past 2 years. Whatever number they were earlier, they have now doubled. Now, when and if, and it started, so I'm not putting a future date to it.
Right.
When and if the digital economy partners with the ed-tech startup, they have the capacity to move far beyond online education.
Right.
Online education is going to become a thing of the past, although not fully. We are going to move into hybrid education. Hybrid education means that this partnership has the capacity to actually create a billion women-centric, indigenous pathways.
Right.
How to reach these women. So, in other words, digital learning is getting democratized.
Right.
So this is the huge future of our women. And when I mentioned earlier about girls gaining ahead of the boys in gross enrollment rates, I wanted to add there. And then therefore now what happens to these girls who have passed class 12? What happens to them? They queue up outside Skill India Mission. Skill India Mission is gaining in scale, in scope, and in diversity.
Yeah.
So they queue up outside Skill India Mission for what? For their entitlement and for their employment. So that is how it's happening. Second, these market relevant skills which these women get in the Skill India Mission, they will align with the smart technology and with AI, artificial intelligence. And I believe that women empowerment will race ahead.
Right.
Why do I believe this? I believe this because we already have data. We have data that India is fast becoming an entrepreneurial nation. And this digital economy is doing precisely that. And what does our entrepreneurial avatar of India, what does it show? It shows that innovation has already given us Aadhaar, India Stack, and UPI. Now, this has strengthened India's image, India's reputation as an inclusive digital innovator. Why inclusive? Because women and men are there at the same time. As many women have Aadhaar cards as they exist, as the men have, as they exist. But going beyond that, the real cause for optimism is this, that small businesses owned or led by women have already outperformed the businesses in the same industries led by men. How have they outperformed them? They generate up to 10% more revenue. And yet, when the men and women are in queue, only 5% of these women-led businesses receive venture capital funding, whereas 77% of men receive it.
Right.
So that is the perception of women.
Right.
But the data on the ground that is coming is quite different.
Right. Taking a cue from you talk about digital economy and digital literacy, couple of years or rather 5-6 years, digital economy has been the word. That's the buzzword. And digital literacy also includes young girls, women, men, all of them. Any more such examples which you think that we can document and we can reach out to other member nations of the South, where I think India has possibly performed very well in last 8-10 years or so, from the gender perspective, from the gender point of view?
What this digital economy in India is doing, which I'm sure would be a very sound example for other member nations, particularly of the South, where the kinship patterns are the same, the family, the households are organized in a similar manner and things like that, is that this digital economy is innovating its toolkit. They know because of the gender differentiation within the household, women cannot always come out to attend full-time school, full-time college, or even full-time training. They're not going to be able to do that. And if you wait for that, you can wait for the next 50 or 100 years. It will happen, but very slowly. So what is the digital economy doing? In my belief, it is going to leapfrog over the patriarchal mindset. We cannot wait for the patriarchal mindset to decide, all right, today my wife can go out, my daughter can marry whoever she wants, and maybe she can even be employed. If you wait for that to happen, but it's happening by example, but what the digital economy is doing, it has realized it has to reach women where they are. Women may not always be able to get to them. So it is developing social media messaging in small bites to women and giving them business sense and business acumen and where to access what. And these women in their own time, in their flexible time, will go and access that. And I think that is flexible training and flexible time-saving tools is something which our digital economy is beginning to develop for women. And I think moving forward in the immediate and in a very futuristic way, this would be a very good management practice to actually share.
Mrs. Mukherjee, if I were to ask you, what would be your takeaway, I mean, in terms of our best practices that India could possibly share with the rest of the world, especially the global South?
Women's empowerment, with Meenakshi, Datta, Ghosh just mentioned, women's empowerment through the Panchayati Raj institutions have played a major role. If I can bring out a small, connected factor, we are also facing a demographic bonus, which means that our population in the young age group is very high, whereas the population in neighboring countries is decreasing and in many further countries is decreasing. So we have this labor force consisting of men and women who are ready to be educated, skilled and ready to go, provided they acquire the right skills.
Right.
So that is something we have to address and do.
Right. Mrs. Ghosh, for you, I think any takeaway lessons? Of course, you have spoken beautifully about this whole digital economy. But other than that, what would be your takeaways in terms of best practices that India could offer to the global South?
I think a very major takeaway which is happening now, and again, I have to come back to the panchayats, is that the elected representatives in the panchayats have been trained over and over and over again in order to ensure that they are able to localize these sustainable development goals. This is a huge good management practice. Why? Because over 60% of our population continues to live in and across rural India, and a little more than that in small towns. They all know their panchayats, they know their nagar palikas, they know their municipal councils. So what is happening is that the Ministry of Panchayati Raj has in 2018 introduced a local government directory, and it has become a standard location directory for all administrative units across the land. But this is the rural panchayats, not the urban.
Right.
Now, what has happened? The government of India has been so pleased with it that the Cabinet Secretariat has accorded approval to it. And it has become a standard location directory across all databases in all ministries and all departments and all states.
Isn't that wonderful? Yeah.
Now, that is something which is so unique
Right.
that it has happened in India. And if this pattern remains, I think it will sustain. If it sustains, it's a huge, for all of us, anybody goes anywhere, you just press the button and you know where you are, who to contact, where to go. So that is one very good management practice. The second one I'll just repeat just now is about localization of sustainable development goals. Now what happened was that India is a signatory to this 2030 agenda for sustainable development, and Niti Aayog has created a nodal cell for sustainable development goals, for their achievement, for their pursuit, for their tracking. But the point is that the success story there is that 17 sustainable development goals have been condensed into 9 themes. And these 9 themes have been given to the panchayats. And these themes are like poverty-free and enhanced livelihood village, healthy village, water-sufficient village, clean and green village, self-sufficient infrastructure village, socially secured village, child-friendly village, village of good governance, and finally, and most important, engendered development for gender equality in villages.
Right.
These are the 9 themes given to them by the Niti Aayog.
Right.
So going from top down, the panchayats have begun talking about this. They've begun thinking about it. They've begun having meetings. They've begun acting on it.
Yeah.
That's a huge plus.
Right.
That the panchayats are also bringing out, under supervision of the state departments and under supervision of central, bringing out disaster management plans. They're bringing out Gram Urja plans, that is local climate action plans.
Right.
They're bringing out Ministry of Renewable Energy is talking to them. The solar energy departments are talking to them.
Right.
The Rural Electrification Corporation is talking to
Clean
them.
water.
Huh?
Clean water.
Clean
is talking
water.
about Sanitation.
Sanitation. Clean water, though, the biggest change in clean water has been program initiated by government, but not by the Ministry of Health, but by the Ministry of Water, called Nal Se Jal. So that is something where every household is getting clean drinking water.
Right.
So that's how these things are getting implemented and actualized on the ground.
So, Mrs. Mukherjee, to start with you, what would be your concluding thoughts? What is it that, I think India could take back to the member nations in G20 and present their best practices or possible lessons that we have learned?
I think the most important thing for women's empowerment is male participation. Men are our partners as fathers, brothers, husbands. And unless they support women's empowerment or as gatekeepers of society, whether they're teachers or religious leaders or whatever, unless they support the development of women, nothing is going to happen. So don't leave out men. Educate men, let them support us as partners. Women are now going to work, girls are getting educated, going for jobs. Let men be sensitized in supporting them in the household, supporting them on the front. Otherwise, women have to leave their jobs and sit at home when the child is sick, when the parents are sick or anything. So men as partners to women's development, that is the most important.
Mrs. Ghosh.
This wonderful narration that we have both participated in just now will see the light of day in the true spirit and reach every woman and girl child across the land. If we were to get the Women's Reservation Bill pending in Parliament for 18 years, we need many more he's to support the she's.
Wonderful. I think it was absolutely wonderful experience to have today's discussion. And I think it was a very lively exchange of ideas. And thank you very, very much, Mrs. Ghosh and Dr. Mukherjee. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
In our national program of talks tonight, you were listening to the panel discussion entitled Women-Led Development and G20. The panelists were Ms. Meenakshi Datta Ghosh, former Special Secretary, Ministry of Health, and Secretary, Ministry of Panchayati Raj, Dr. Suneeta Mukherjee, former bureaucrat and UNFPA or the United Nations Population Fund official, and Deepak Gupta, media personality, who initiated and moderated the discussion. Produced and presented by Naveen K. Gupta of All India Radio Delhi, this program came to you from the Delhi station of All India Radio.